Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Nonprofit, charitable giving, voluntary activities are truly central to the provision of the public good in this country. While the European model is much more pervasive with social public policy and compelling it that way, Americans, Carolinians, if you will, choose to do it through overt goodwill and philanthropic means. In other words, give to charities. Welcome again, and thanks so much for supporting the most widely watched dialogue on Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and thank you for your support. And this time, with decades of generous giving, what is the state of philanthropy in our region? What indelible mark has the Great Recession left on this charitable world? We will wade into the most talked about issues around philanthropy with four authorities who are at the center of this world, if you will. And we start in just a moment.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Jay Everett of Wells Fargo Social Responsibility Group, Madeline McGee of the South Carolina Association of Nonprofit Organizations, Karen McNeil Miller of the Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust, and Jean Cochran from the Duke Endowment. Now, here's Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. And welcome to the dialogue, for better or for worse. Good to have you both here. Karen, I'm going to ask you because you are closest. It's about as scientific as it gets. So much we've talked about the Great Recession, and we even refer to this economy now, Karen, as a recovery. And, we're way past that now, at least in my opinion. But how is charitable giving and charitable doing and philanthropy, how is it different now in 2015 than it was prior to the economic meltdown in 2008?
Well, since 2008, which has been a challenge for all of us, I think on the philanthropic side, at least, all of us are seeing our assets grow back to pre-2008 levels so that our giving can be back to the same level then. During that time, though, we all had to focus. We had to decide how we were going to use fewer resources at a time when there was a greater need. And we've seen in the urban areas a lot of recovery, but we still see a lot of need in the rural areas. And so our foundation, Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust, has a great focus on the rural area. Now, I think Madeline probably has a perspective on what the nonprofits are feeling since 2008, what they're doing.
That was a good pitch.
Well, the United Way of Greenville just last night completed their most successful campaign to date, $16.6 million, which for North Carolina may not be as much, but it's the largest in South Carolina's history. And so it's the largest. So that was a success. The community foundations started doing the online giving, crowdfunding with Giving Days last year, and the Charleston Community Foundation raised $2.5 million in the one day. And of all the community foundations in the country participating on that day, they raised the most. Spartanburg Community Foundation, out of the 700 community foundations, was just listed number 20 in the per capita giving, number of gifts per capita. So the pockets of philanthropy, we don't have the private institutions that you have in North Carolina, but the philanthropy is really, I think, coming of age in South Carolina.
And you know what, Jean, you were nodding your head when Karen was saying something. What did you agree with necessarily?
I thought Karen's point about focus that came through the hard times was actually helpful for us in a lot of ways. To your point about pre-2008, when the stock market was so strong and most of us had cash, it was easier to fund a lot of projects and a lot of organizations. When 2008 came, everyone had to be more thoughtful about funding and who you funded and what your expectations were for that funding. And all those years were really difficult on nonprofits, on our society, and on foundations. Coming out of it, though, I think we, the collective we of foundations, are more thoughtful today about the results we're looking for. I think we're more planful about where we invest the dollars. I think we think differently, especially in terms of cooperation, of length of time, of amounts of money, than we did prior to that.
So to what Gene said, so does that mean outcomes are better?
I think in some cases. I think that going back to 2008, some groups tried to collaborate, tried to get more focused, and tried to get a little more discipline in what they were doing to drive outcomes. But to get to outcomes, you really have to be very specific about what you want to achieve. It requires a whole lot of work. It requires collaboration across nonprofits, partnering with funders, and that's hard work. But where we see groups coming together to work on collective impact with a real strong goal and with agreed upon measurements and having the right partners at the table, we are seeing great impact. With nonprofits that we fund that are individual, that are kind of going off on their own direction with blinders on and that type of thing, not quite as much.
You know, it's funny, but I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to go back to something you said, Madeline. You used the term crowdfunding. I can't imagine that prior to 2008, anybody in charity would have used crowdfunding, or let alone social venture partner type of funding. You're all smiling. Is this a new way of thinking about the old paradigm?
I don't even think they were doing it in 2011 in South Carolina. It's very new for us. But we just had a startup nonprofit saving Eliza, one of the rare diseases, Sanfilippo syndrome, through GoFundMe, raised $1.8 million in a year.
Karen?
Well, just look at the ice bucket challenge.
Yeah.
You know, and what that did. That was amazing.
Yeah.
And it's to Jay's point. I think we figured out since 2008 that it's really not about how much money. It's about how much change. And how do we get the greatest change for the human condition, for whatever that we're all focused on.
Yeah, since you started this, Gene, about this line of, we think about how we apply it, maybe a little bit more thoughtful, I think was your term. So does that mean, I'll ask you the same question that Jay answered, does that mean that you can measure and the outcomes are better now?
I think we're getting better at the process, first. Secondly, I think we're thinking about it differently. Outcomes in the first part of this century were more turnstile counts. How many people came to this service? How many people participated?
Yeah.
The question now is, I'm glad they participated. Are they any better? Did they learn any more? Is the single service, if it was successful, then what about the other issues that family faces? And are we addressing those tangential issues that are impacting that first issue that we were trying to address? Much more complicated issue, but the metrics, we're all learning how to do those metrics when it is so many different multiple factors you're trying to understand.
So again, how is the application of social venture funding and crowdfunding, how has it changed the kind of the calculus at a corporation like Wells? I almost said Wachovia, but I think
it's interesting. We leverage some of that internally. We've got over close to 35,000 team members in the Carolinas, and we've done some things internally around community support campaigns that leverage some of the new social media, the idea of groups coming together to fund specific nonprofits under a category like education or housing. And team members react and respond to that. But I think the bigger question, I want to go back to like the Ice Bucket Challenge, now that they've had such success with it, I think it's incumbent upon them to come back to show what is the true outcome. How has it moved the needle on research? And I'm a big fan of crowdfunding. I'm a big fan of using social media to drive change. But if these organizations that have done so well with it don't come back and show the public what the outcome is and the benefit and the impact of that, I'm afraid that people won't be as excited about it the next time we have a big surge in it.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Gene, what are you going to say?
I think you're right. I mean, I think we all applauded the ice bucket, but what's the next ice bucket look like? And what does it take to generate that kind of motivation. And does society get tired of it? Which is another way to me of saying, which we all have debated, how do you do it, is how do you ensure permanence in what works?
Right.
And that's always the $64,000 question. We've seen many programs that worked in over a 1, 2, 3 year time horizon. Keeping them working 10 years from now is a very different trick.
So what are the answers you have through the association in South Carolina?
Well, we had this conversation before the show about the great increase in the number of nonprofits that are being started. And sometimes we go, oh my gosh, we really can't afford to have more nonprofits. We don't have enough resources.
Are there more now than there were pre-2008?
Yes, the number between...
It's growing.
Oh, in the last decade, South Carolina increased 93% in the number. We now employ 7% of all employees in South Carolina work for a nonprofit. So, huge increase.
How is that possible? I thought consolidation happened after 2008.
Well, that was going from 10 years, so doing that. But I honestly, I didn't see that much consolidation after 2008.
I didn't either.
I know of 3 groups that closed.
There were some consolidation, but what we experienced was that a lot of organizations, where in the past they would come to us for funds to start new programs or expand existing programs, people stuck with their knitting. They stuck with their core, they stayed mission focused, and they did the essential work of the organization. So they weren't expanding out, but so they were just trying to keep what the work that they were doing, the core work that they were doing going.
Go ahead, were you going to say?
I was just say, you know, it's been 5-6 years, but I think a lot of them did what businesses did, was they used that period to focus on what was most important. And now, as the resources have come back, I see a number of them going in totally different directions, particularly in the child care. You know, and really being able to be more nimble and to try different strategies, not only in program delivery, but in their fundraising, because they have consolidated and gotten focused on their operations.
Many of them got smaller.
Yeah.
But does that make the job of allocating at the head of an endowment or some type of funding mechanism, does that make it harder to figure out now that you have more smaller and more exacting type, does it?
It's a very crowded field, and when you cover areas like Wells Fargo around economic empowerment, community development, arts and culture, you know, K through 12 public education, you're really opened up to this broad array of so many nonprofits that are existing, and then all of these that are starting up that are new. And they all start with the greatest of intention, and I think that there's this system that drives it behind the scenes. We all work with boards and that type of thing, but every nonprofit has an executive director, they have a board, they have people that are volunteers that are passionately driving it, and it becomes this machine that keeps going. And one of the things that we in our role try to ask the nonprofits to do is stop and take a look at the landscape around what the bigger issues are going on in the community or across the region, across North and South Carolina, and say, where can you partner? Where is the biggest opportunity to collaborate? If you were to pull resources from these 4 nonprofits together that touch different elements of this social problem, and we have some agreed upon measures around it of what an outcome actually is, and we are all going to kind of have a North Star about the work that we're doing, then we feel like that's probably the better opportunity to get to that impact that we were talking about earlier.
And I think that has led many foundations more to looking at evidence-based practices, which are programs or interventions that have been tested and proven to have positive results.
But Karen, how do they do that if they don't have funding to get to the point where they actually have results?
Well, so the evidence-based practices usually are huge programs that have years of research behind them. The ones you're talking about, I would consider, are developing practice-based evidence. So
you lost me about 2 minutes ago.
They're doing the work, and it's showing promise. And so you can look in retrospect and see if it's working, but then in the moment, you have to look to see, is this moving towards, is this predictive? Is what we're doing predictive of success? And I think there should be equal emphasis, in my opinion, on practice-based evidence as well as evidence-based practice.
Then
Chris, to your question though, I mean,
I like that idea.
how do you help a nonprofit that doesn't have the resources to look at measurement?
Right, thank you.
And one difference is that we are actually funding grants now on providing research and measurement as opposed to just unrestricted grants funding the nonprofit. And in North and South Carolina, one of the big benefits we have is higher education. And programs where we've partnered with higher education, it could be partnership with a Davidson College, a Clemson, it could be UNC Asheville. We are asking their areas to manage research. And it's a great opportunity for students that are studying research and methodologies to get involved, and they do it at a lower cost, and it starts to create some of that higher education nonprofit partnership. And we just completed a study on domestic violence and the economic impact of that across the state of North Carolina. UNC Charlotte did that work.
Next week on this program, by the way, Carl Armato is the CEO of Novant Health, and talk about philanthropy. They have their own initiatives, and we'll probably talk to Carl about that. But Jay brings up a good point, and I want to ask you this, Gene. He mentions Davidson College. He mentions higher education. We, not long ago, met 3 weeks ago on this program, we had Davidson College, Wofford, J.C. Smith University, and Converse College presidents talking about, and I want to call it the unsustainability of a higher education cost. What can, well, we'll call it the Duke Endowment, but what could a funder do to influence that dialogue to go in the way of maybe finding a solution around unsustainable costs?
Chris, that's a wonderful question, and I wish I had that silver dollar answer for it. I think there are actually, you mentioned Carl being on next week, I think there are great parallels, really interesting parallels between healthcare and higher education. Both have a large external funder, being the federal government. Both have players on their campuses, either the physician or the tenured faculty, that have certain management issues about the product they're trying to deliver. Both are being affected by technology and changing technology. Certainly the colleges are by the massive online classes. How
Both
we
have ever-increasing costs.
ever-increased costs. How we figure out to bend the cost curve for those very important institutions at a time when society is asking them to take care of a very different product. On a college campus, it's that student that has probably lower economic assets that's academically qualified but is now appearing on the campus. It's not all children of doctors and lawyers as it was in our generation that were going to college. In healthcare, many of our hospitals are experiencing a very high percentage of the births being Latino Hispanic children. Again, a very different service delivery requirement that they're being faced now with. It's tough, and I think it worries the thoughtful leaders a lot about how do they sustain that.
Do you hear anything differently about what impact ScanPo or any of your members, clients, if you want to call them clients, can have on that unsustainable cost of higher ed?
I think on higher ed, not so much. We don't work as much with the larger institutions. We'd like to, but I think everyone is looking to technology for the answer. And I'll take our organization just as one example. When I got there, we were probably spending 30% on real estate, overhead, staff time, processing, finances, whether it was member dues, whatever, through outsourcing the technology and reducing and going virtual. We've reduced our own operating overhead by probably 25%, actually even greater than that. So I think technology has lots of answers for us, the online education.
Sorry to interrupt you, Matt. Before we leave this, and I want to save you for healthcare, because I know you can't wait to get into that one. Jay, with Wells Fargo, and we'll just pick on Wells Fargo because you represent Wells as being a fairly large corporate entity in the Carolinas. So how does Wells influence that dialogue about unsustainable higher education?
Our focus is really on K through 12 education, so we aren't as often in that space of higher education, but what we are seeing is, quite frankly, answering the question of, you have to look at the talent pipeline that goes into a four-year college or university, and there's a lot of research and information that says that that's not necessarily the be-all and end-all, and that's putting a lot of focus on technical and trade schools. And once again, in the Carolinas, we have one of the most amazing networks of community colleges, and so what we are starting to fund more grants around are programs that start at the 9th grade to determine, working with school guidance counselors and teachers and looking at academic performance and input from the student, what track do you want to be on? Do you want a more expensive four-year college, or this technical and trade track is a perfectly good track to be on, to have a great living wage and to have a great job? And so there are programs now that we're funding that are all about helping students that just select that track to get to that point. And so part of the question is, what number of students do you have going into four-year colleges and universities that are much more expensive when you have community colleges that typically have lower tuition costs?
So, Karen, both North and South Carolina governors have been opposed to taking Medicaid dollars. Let's go on a different track. How punitive is that to a growing economy? I think that's an easy question, but the tougher question might be, what case can be made to take federal dollars, even given the fairly good argument that both Republican governors have made that the system is broken and we don't want to fund something that's not efficient?
Well, we actually are trying to make that argument. Several foundations funded a study to look at the economic impact of not expanding Medicaid per county, by county in the North Carolina. And we think there's a terrific argument to be made that not only if you don't expand Medicaid are there health issues at stake, individual health issues, but there are economic issues at the local level. The jobs
local rural or local urban?
Both.
Everywhere.
It's not a rural or urban issue. The jobs that would be created, the health that would be extended to, the health care that could be extended to citizens. So we think there's a strong argument to be made to do that soon, and it would be on my wish list for this General Assembly.
Do you think you can get the General Assembly in 2015 to consider this seriously? Or the governor in 2015? He seems like he's made...
It seems like the governor's willing to consider it.
Gene, what has some of your board talked about around this issue of Medicaid?
Much the same as Karen was saying, that we're trying to understand where that trade-off is of economic benefit versus the longer-term cost to society. I think we're all coming down on the side that in a perfect world, our states would be participating.
Anyone else? Don't care to wade into that one. Is that right, Jay?
I'd say I agree.
I would agree, but you've got the subject matter experts here.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about this whole idea of talent. It's not unique in the corporate world to be able to hold on to talent when companies come and poach talent. It seems like that's not unique in the corporate world, but that seems like trying to develop talent and keep talent within a nonprofit is a tough thing too. So when you're funding a nonprofit, when you've made an agreement with a nonprofit to be a funder and you've got a high turnover, how much does that affect not just outcome, but how does it affect the way that you look at the way you're going to do it again on the next cycle of funding?
You've named something that's a challenge. When you invest in a nonprofit and then there's a leadership change as a funder, you kind of question what's the status of that investment and how will it shift and change. And so one of the things that we've actually done is gotten into the business of providing grants that allow nonprofit leaders to go through leadership development training, professional development opportunities and experiences, because within a nonprofit, there's the sense that you have to manage your budget extremely tightly, and there's really no line item for that type of development. And when we went out and spoke to a lot of nonprofit leaders, they said, this is what we're missing and this is what we really need. And so we actually put 30 different nonprofit leaders of nonprofits that we funded through a very extensive 4-day leadership development program, and we've gotten great results back. And we just did some analysis. This was 2 years ago that we did this, and of those people that went through the program, I think it's like 85% are still with the nonprofit that they were with previously, which is great.
Anybody have a different take?
I'd just say absolutely. The people that are drawn to the nonprofit field have passion for the cause. They don't necessarily have management experience. So when you have someone that knows the cause, knows how to make change happen, but they're suddenly put in a position of being an executive director, and they need that training.
And aren't you including this in your upcoming conference development?
Yeah, we've probably got 80 people coming on scholarships from funders. And I watch the difference. When we put on a training and the funder is not at the table, there's sort of okay, maybe we should go. But when the funder says this is important, the nonprofits, and it's
Do you see an interest, an immediate return on investment for that kind of training? And we've got about 20 seconds left. Yeah. Yes?
Yes.
You do?
But,
Okay.
and in the large part because they suddenly believe someone cares about me, they're investing in me.
Perfect.
That sense of nurturing that leader.
Thank you.
They
Last
need to
word.
be nurtured.
Thank you. I know that's a fair question to throw that one at you, like who should run for president? I'm not going to do that.
Nurture
Thank you.
your nonprofit leaders.
Thank you.
Go.
Thank you all for being on the program. Gosh, I know it's a tough industry, but you all have done a great
Thank
job
you.
leading it. Thank you for being here. Nice to see you all.
I'd rather work.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Next week, Carl Armato. Until then, we hope your weekend is good and your business too. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health. Bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco. A global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.